Welcome and thank you for joining us today for What's Tax Got to Do with It? Tax Equity and the Progressive Movement, presented by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. We have an exciting lineup today, but first, a few details. Today's webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording and other resources mentioned in today's broadcast will be emailed to registrants and made available at itep.org in the coming days. You can follow ITEP on Twitter at ITEPtweets or our Facebook page and use the hashtag #TaxJusticeIs to continue these important conversations. If you have a question during the webinar, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send your questions for our panelists. Your question may be answered live during the webinar, and there will also be time for Q&A at the end of the panel session. The chat box will not be monitored for questions to panelists, so please submit all questions using the Q&A window. That's all for the details. Now let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Amy Hanauer, Executive Director of both the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy and Citizens for Tax Justice. Amy?
Thank you. So I was thrilled to join the fight for tax justice nationwide here at the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. And I have to say, it was so affirming to see so many familiar names on the registration list, people who I know are doing the work every single day to get better policies in communities across the country. It is our 40th year here at ITEP, and we were picturing celebrating with all of you on a rooftop somewhere, but I think this is the closest we come to a party in 2020 is me getting to read your names on this list. So thank you so much. Look, ITEP and its phenomenal team of researchers have been fighting for fair, adequate, equitable taxes for 40 years, and they've been getting the ammunition for those fights to social movements, reporters, legislators, and regular people from Montana to Memphis to Maine and everywhere in between. I know that because for the last 20 years, I ran Policy Matters Ohio, an Ohio-based policy research institute, and we could not have done our work without ITEP. Every time that Ohio policymakers tried to cut income taxes, ITEP helped show us who would be enriched by those tax cuts and who would actually end up worse off. So ITEP was always there for us. They have a small but mighty team, but that group of people is the people who figured out that 91 profitable Fortune 500 companies, including Amazon and Chevron, paid zero in federal taxes the first year after Trump's tax law went into effect. They're behind the research showing that the poorest fifth of people pay about 50% more of their income in state and local taxes than the wealthiest 1% in the average state. And they've shown how the Trump tax changes slash taxes for the top 1%, people earning more than $600,000 a year, by about $50,000 on average, and left us with less to spend on healthcare, on poverty relief, and on clean energy, which actually turned out to be a pretty abysmal decision in a year where 195,000 Americans have died in a pandemic and where the entire West Coast is on fire. So, apocalyptic realities aside, this event is going to leave you feeling ready to turn things around. As someone who I sent the lineup to said, we're making tax policy fun again. So we have an amazing panel of activists and organizers at 2:30, which we'll introduce later. But first, we have the best senator anyone could ever ask for, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio. Look, in my work in Ohio, I knew Senator Brown as someone who always spoke out for working people, for, as he puts it, the dignity of work. I always knew that he fought for economic justice and social justice for everyone, whether they were taking care of our kids or making our cars or stocking our grocery shelves. And I knew he was uniquely willing to stand up to corporations and lobbyists when it came to worker policy. But I have to confess, and do not tell my new coworkers and board, I didn't necessarily focus on the fact that he served on the Finance Committee and that he fought corporations just as hard when they tried to evade or lower their federal tax obligations as when they tried to lower wages or avoid workplace safety laws. So I started this new job in January, just after Senator Brown's book, Desk 88, came out, and you can see it here. And reading it, I was elated to be reminded that he was just as fierce, informed, and righteous on tax policy as he was on workers and on jobs. Also, I know that I can't get away with showing Senator Brown's book without also showing his wife, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Connie Schultz's book, which I also read, I bought for my mother. They're both great, and maybe in another world I can have a conversation about family and romantic entanglements in a working class community on the shores of Lake Erie. But Today, we're talking taxes. And so, as Senator Brown details in his book, he's fought to expand the earned income tax credit, which goes to struggling working families. He knows it's unfair to tax earnings from work more than earnings from wealth. He understands the absurdity of letting the tax code reward companies that move jobs overseas. He's relentless in talking about all of these. Yes, in Zooms like this one, full of amazing, righteous fighters, but also in rooms full of corporate lobbyists that don't agree with him. So Senator Brown knows that tax justice is racial justice, tax justice is gender justice, it's climate justice and health justice. In a pandemic, on a baking planet, in an age of gut-wrenching inequality, we need the clarity, insight, and tireless ferocity of Sherrod Brown. And I am so grateful that he took some time in his swamped schedule to spend with you all today. Thank you, Senator, and please take it away.
Thank you, Amy. It's wonderful to see Amy Hanauer again. I used to see Amy Hanauer much more. My wife and I, first time, actually when Connie and I we'd actually not started dating at that point. We were at a rally. I was speaking against the Iraq War in early 2003. I'm trying to think when the vote had already come, or was about to come, doesn't matter. But Connie was in the crowd with her daughter. And Connie and I had met for dinner once, and we had met not really online, but she's a columnist for the Plain Dealer. And since then, she won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, writing always about workers and racial justice and women's health and gay rights. And Connie, in fact, said to somebody later, or she told me later, that she wouldn't have gone out with me if she hadn't checked my voting record and it weren't 100% on gay rights and women's and choice. So, but anyway, Amy was in the crowd with her small little daughter then on her shoulders at this rally. And I remember seeing Amy with her daughter waving their arms and screaming with people against the Iraq War. So that's when Connie and I first started falling in love with Amy Hanauer. So thank you. And we hate that you're here now instead of Cleveland, but we know you keep a foot in both places. And just thanks. And the work you all do. Dorian, thank you. And Maurice and Ben and Amisha, thank you all for being part of this panel today. Staff at ITEP really does matter. Amy said it better than I could of what my staff, Chad, especially on my staff, and I rely on the breadth and rigor of your analysis. We have a better understanding of tax policy and really how tax policy affects people's individual lives. So many people's eyes glaze over when you talk about tax policy, but everybody's affected in the most acute and direct ways by what we do. And everything I do in public office, Amy sort of suggested that, but it really is kind of comes through the prism of the dignity of work. The term dignity of work was originally found from the labor Pope Leo XIII from the turn of the last century, but it was more popularized by Dr. King, who talked so well about the dignity of work. And I remember a couple of years ago that I didn't know her well at this point, but the relatively new senator from California, Senator Harris, knew I talked about dignity of work a lot. And we were talking on the Senate floor right after the Dr. King holiday. And she said, what'd you talk about and we were talking about, she went to one in California, I went to one, I think that year in Columbus. And I told her I talked a lot about the dignity of work, and she then 3 days later gave me a book called All Work Has Dignity. It was a compilation of Dr. King's speeches, and Dr. King understood that the dignity of work and workers' rights and civil rights are so intertwined. You know where Dr. King was when he was assassinated. He was fighting for sanitation workers, Blacks, overwhelmingly, I may be 100% Black, I'm not sure, sanitation workers in Memphis, workers that were surely exploited in terms of their wages and their benefits, and equally importantly, their treatment on the job in terms of safety. But the dignity of work is the idea that work should pay off for everyone, and whether you swipe a badge or punch a clock, whether you work for tips or a salary, whether you are caring for parents or for aging parents or raising children. And whether your hard work isn't paying off, and when we know that hard work doesn't pay off today the way it did some time ago, especially for Black and brown workers. When work has dignity, everyone can afford health care. People have a retirement to work towards that they can count on. And people know that they can have a decent place to live. Today, 1/4 of all renters in this country pay more than half their rent pay more than half their wages in rent. And that means one thing happens in their life, their car breaks down, their child gets sick, they miss a few days of work because of a minor workplace injury, and they can face eviction. And when they face eviction, their life turns upside down. So when work has dignity, people have power over their lives and their schedules. Workers are treated as essential, not expendable. A grocery store worker told me early in the pandemic, they call me an essential worker, but they don't pay me decent wages, and they don't treat me so that I don't feel safe on the job. The pandemic, in so many ways, has become the great revealer. We know, white America knows so much more now about racial disparities, something Black America knew and some of white America knew, but knows so much more about racial disparities because of this pandemic. In housing, which went from the Black codes to Jim Crow, to redlining, to Trump locking in discriminatory housing policy, to infant mortality and maternal mortality and life expectancy, to, of course, the justice system, and of course, in so many other ways, wealth inequality. When workers feel expendable, it's really how corporations have treated their workers for decades. This pandemic has brought it out in the open. Our tax code could, and that's what ITEP's all about, and what Policy Matters in Cleveland was all about. It could, the tax code could be a tool to fix it, but instead, Leader McConnell and President Trump make things worse. We know the lies they told people about their tax cut. You remember the promises Trump made that his law would mean raises for workers. I was actually in the room. I don't know this president well. I've been in 4 or 5 meetings and maybe had 2 phone conversations with him. But the first meeting I was in was in the cabinet room with probably 8 or 10 senators, some of each party. And because I'm on the tax writing committee, I was in the room, and Trump said 2 things. He said, we're going to see millions of jobs. I think he said, no, I don't remember how many million he said in that meeting. Yeah, I mean, it changed in every meeting. But then he said, and every worker is going to get at least a $4,000 raise. He of course, that was just all talk. It was all pablum. He said, you're going to start seeing that when he signed the bill, he said, you're going to start seeing a lot more money in your paycheck. I handed him after that meeting 2 bills I was working on, called related to the Patriot Corporation Act, that if companies would get a lower tax rate if they paid good wages, paid into a decent retirement, and provided health care, then they would get a lower tax rate. The president said that was just I went up to him afterwards, said that's a great idea. Of course, he didn't do anything about it. We knew he wouldn't, but we wanted him to have the opportunity to at least look at it. When we need a tax code that helps us narrow income inequality and racial wealth gap, we can't totally address structural racism unless we, in part, address it in the tax code, in housing, and healthcare, and so many other things. And we need a president and IRS committed to enforcing a tax code that works for people. People generally know about the Republican tax scam. This tax bill has really not helped Trump politically, I don't think at all. Most Americans, though, don't realize that, at least, as Amy's pointed out, at least 60 corporations in the Fortune 500 paid no income tax at all in 2018, 0. 60 of America's largest corporations paid no tax at all. I mean, that's the kind of thing that outrage people when they know about it. They kind of don't know whom to blame. They kind of think all politicians are the same, and they don't know where to turn. That's the importance of ITEP, that you have explained to people, and you explain every day what tax policy means. Meanwhile, you have workers, as those corporations don't pay, you have workers making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year who pay taxes, paying more than their fair share. And under Trump, the IRS goes after them. I've worked for 25 years on expanding the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. And we know that the IRS is more concerned with auditing a single mother making $35,000 a year that might get a $3,000 tax credit through the EITC and get a little help from CTC. We know that the government's more interested in auditing them than they are auditing a millionaire that lives in Pepper Pike, Ohio. We need a tax code that builds opportunity for low-income families, not ones that help the already wealthy accumulate more wealth. We need an IRS that can take on and take down tax dodging corporations, one that goes after them instead of people who claim the earned income tax credit. Under Trump, the IRS is literally disproportionately auditing. It's not just rhetoric. It's disproportionately auditing low-income workers, and many of them, they're disproportionately workers of color. If the stars align next year, we have a chance to do really big things. And one of the top priorities is to put our tax code to work to make hard work actually pay off for everyone who's been left behind. One of the big ways to do that is the Working Families Tax Relief Act. We have almost every single, introduced by Michael Bennett and me, joining soon after were Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. We have almost every single Democrat in the Senate on board. It would dramatically, as co-sponsors, it would dramatically expand the earned income tax credit and child tax credit. It would finally plug a lot of holes in those tax credits. But we can be clear, we can use the tax code in the fight for justice, for economic justice, for racial justice. We can pass passing working families would boost the incomes of 8 million Black households, 9 million Latino households. It would help 16 million women of color. These are real dollars in their pockets. They're $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. We also work at the same time on a renter's tax credit to help families with the biggest item in their budgets, the cost of housing. I fear right now, because McConnell and Trump simply don't care, that the $600 a week unemployment insurance, which kept as many as 12 million people out of poverty, $600 a week, as you know, just disappeared in August because Trump and McConnell wanted it to disappear. And we know that that's made such a difference in keeping people in their homes. And I fear, I'm not an alarmist, but I fear what may happen in the next few weeks if McConnell can't be convinced to come back, do his job, bring us back to Washington, do our jobs to extend that unemployment benefit. As I said earlier, 1 in 4 renters spend more than half their income on housing. And if we don't do something for renters, especially in addition to the CTC and the ITC, we've simply not done our jobs. We've already put our tax code to work for homeowners. We can do the same thing for renters. People like me get a deduction. People like some of you get a deduction on your mortgage. That's the great middle class tax break that pretty much all of us support. We need to look at renters who are generally, not always, but generally lower income than homeowners. We need to look at them. If you're already wealthy, you have a vacation home, you could collect a tax deduction. But if you're making $12 an hour and just paying rent, you get nothing. Our plan's tax credit will mean no one pays more than 30% of their income in rent. It will make a difference for so many workers who struggle paycheck to paycheck even more than the pandemic. This isn't going to be easy. Even if Democrats win the White House and the Senate in November, this is not an automatic thing to happen. We know corporate lobbyists never give up. We know when we win big progressive victories, whether it was during the Roosevelt years or the Johnson years or even the early Obama years, we know the right wing and corporate lobbyists never give up. So they are unrelenting. Emerson once said that the history is a battle between the innovators and the conservators. The conservators just want to hang on to their money and privilege and tightly grasp it. Innovators want to move the country forward. You're the innovators, ITEP, and we need you because we know they never give up. We need you to stay engaged. This isn't an election rally or you aren't a partisan group, but work on this election on whatever way you want. But the work just really begins on November 4th. So you're organizing your research, you're educating policy members and the public. It really does matter. So I'll close with one of my favorite Dr. King quotes. He in the letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963. One of my good friends in the Senate, Doug Jones, the new member from Alabama, who's facing a difficult race because it's Alabama. He organized 5 or 6 of his colleagues to go to the Senate floor about 2 months ago and read Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, one of the one of the most important, letters, one of the most important missives, one of the most important documents in civil rights history, to be sure. And he let me read the part of the letter that I particularly liked, where Dr. King said, speaking to some moderate, decent people that just didn't think we should go too fast on civil rights. And he needed to light a fire under these, many of them ministers and white ministers. And he said, progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It rolls in because of Amisha and Dorian and Maurice and Stephanie and Amy and all of you watching. It rolls in because of your activism. And we need you now, between now and election day, and we need you after the election to make Congress do what it should do and what we all talk about doing and what we promise to do. So Amy, thank you. And we can have a couple of minutes for questions, right? Can't hear you. Oh.
Yeah. So
cool.
I'm gonna ask one, and Dorian's gonna ask one. And I really appreciate your remarks, Senator. One of the things that Senator Brown often says back in Ohio is, don't tell me what you believe, show me what you do, and I'll tell you what you believe. And I can't tell you how often I think about that when I'm thinking about going to bed. Instead of doing a little more work, I think, no, I'm gonna show with what I do. And so
that make me feel guilty. I want you to get to rest. Jeez. That's not originally my quote. It was a civil rights leader in the 60s, but you know, how many original thoughts are there out there? But thank you, Amy.
Well, I hear it in my head often. So look, you talk in your book a lot about the things that taxes pay for that enable working class people to have a decent life. And I want to know, like, how do you make that case to working people, many of whom may be bombarded with inaccurate messages from the right all the time? How do you make the case when you're constantly hearing this anti-government rhetoric in America these days?
That is exactly the right question. Last night, my paperback book came out yesterday, actually, and last night I was interviewed by the Kennedy Library in Boston, by remote, of course, and one local, I think Quincy High School, I think was the school, I'm not sure, a teacher who was to assign my book, which is the first time I've ever heard anybody's done that, which was pretty cool. But he said that his class was reading Profiles in Courage every year. He switched to my book, and he said, he asked that question almost identical. He said, what if you had one message for these students who are reading this, what would it be? And I think the most important, or what would you study, or what would you want them to know? And I think the most important thing is the role of government, and that government can be, you know, when I said that Emerson said that it's a battle between the innovators and the conservators. Money interests never go away, and they win, and they shape government for their interests. When innovators win, we move government, we do Medicare, we do Social Security, we pass civil rights, we pass the Higher Ed Act for Pell Grants. We passed the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, to put money in people's pockets. We fight for unemployment insurance. So I think that it really, so somebody said the public is philosophically conservative, but practically liberal. And what that means to me is, yeah, I don't like government. I don't like big government, but I sure do like Social Security. I sure do like the overtime rule that puts money in my pocket. I sure like minimum wage. I sure like environmental laws. I sure like food safety laws. So when you're talking to people, be specific about what this means. If we have a debate about government or big government, we're probably going to, we don't lose among this crowd or me. I'm for that. But we do lose much of the public if we don't speak very much more specifically about the role of government and how it makes people's lives better. This pandemic absolutely shows that. If government hadn't stepped in, we haven't stepped in the way we should for schools, for rent, but when we have stepped in, it's made a huge difference.
Yeah. Dorian?
So Senator Brown, first of all, thank you for continuing to be a champion around racial, gender, and economic justice. And
that's Congress. An impressive bookshelf behind you, Dorian.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're a lovely guy. I'm impressed.
Your book is out here. Your book is out here somewhere.
I didn't say it for that reason. That's okay.
Well, I also want to thank you for your leadership, especially around the Working Families Tax Relief Act and so many of the other crucial bills on which you lead. I know this is a C3 context. Some of us on this call do C4 work too, but my question for you is, what advice do you have for people who want to keep the pressure up and on their elected officials to make sure we get tax and economic policy, not just this year, but especially 2021, 2022, that advances social justice?
Yeah, it's a thank you for that question, Dorian, and your kind words. It's all about stories. And you talk about what the earned income tax, when I was in Congress, the problem with the earned income tax credit in part is a lot of people don't know they can claim it. And so we used to organize, I used to organize a program in ACRE and in Lorraine to get people to, accountants would volunteer, local accountants, and we'd publicize it well, and anybody could come in and have help on claiming EITC and CTC. And the stories that you would hear from people, many people came back the third and the fourth year. I mean, they did it every year. And what that extra $2,800 meant for them, for school clothes, for a nicer apartment, for staying in their apartment, for fixing their car, never buying a new car hardly, but I mean, all of those things. If you just, there's the stories of people who have gotten EITC. There's the story of what a family would do with the child tax credit with that extra $3,000. There's the story of single young men who can't claim the EITC because they're not eligible. Because we haven't expanded it the way we want. So it's both what this has meant to me, Dorian, and what it's meant to me and what I've done with those dollars improving my life. And it's the story of what I could do if this were expanded and expanded in its scope and increased in its dollar amount. And so that's what keeps me going, that I know we have to do those things in this country. I mean, I was talking, I drive back, I don't drive. I drive sometimes. I ride back and forth Washington. A young man in my office drives, and I do that every week because I don't want to get on a plane for obvious reasons. And we're just talking about this job, and he's a young man in his 20s, very idealistic, smart, really smart, works in our office for some time. And we're just talking about if you have the opportunity in your job, and all of you do, to make such a decisive difference in the lives of people that didn't have the advantages. I don't know your personal backgrounds, of course, a little bit about Amy's, but not the rest of you. If you have the advantage in life that I did, or you now do in this job, you have an opportunity and a duty to make so many people's lives better. I know what I did with CITC and EITC 5 years ago with Nancy Pelosi, made a whole lot of people's lives better. I could have ended my career with that because I know the impact it had on people. And think of that. Think of getting to devote your life to that as so many of you are doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. This is why I'm proud to call you our senator. I really, really appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Glad you're doing so well. All right. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all. Thank you.
Take care.
So I want to take just a second to introduce Dorian Warren, who is the phenomenal president of Community Change, which builds the power of people, especially low-income people and people of color, to fight for a society where everyone can thrive. He's also co-chair of the Economic Security Project, which is fighting for better incomes for low-income Americans every day, and supports our work at the same time. Look, you've cheered for him at rallies, you've seen him on TV, you will feel better after listening to him. I always feel better after I've talked to Dorian. So I give you Dorian Warren, one of America's bravest and brainiest voices for racial, economic, and justice.
Thank you, Amy. It's very kind of you. And I just want to appreciate your leadership and for bringing us all together. And happy 40th anniversary to ITEP. It's a cause for celebration, and hopefully we'll be able to do it in person next year. So I want to quickly introduce our rock star panel. I mean, Amy, you couldn't have not put together a more amazing group of folks. And then we're going to get into the conversation. So Amisha Patel is Executive Director of Grassroots Collaborative and Grassroots Illinois Action, organizations working to win racial and economic justice in Chicago and statewide. And she and her team organize Illinois residents to build power for working families by fighting for progressive revenue solutions, living wage jobs, and quality public schools. And on a personal note, I've known Amisha for 20 years now. We were teenagers, I'd like to think, when we first met. I feel like we grew up together. She is the very best organizer in Chicago and the state of Illinois. And what she's going to talk about today is going to be game-changing for Illinois and for the country. We'll also hear from Maurice BP-Weeks, who is the co-executive director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy. He works with community organizations and labor unions on campaigns to go on offense against Wall Street to beat back their destruction of communities of color. He is on vacation, y'all, and he came out of vacation just to do this panel and this event. He is the smartest strategic corporate researcher and organizer in the country on the intersection of racial justice and corporate power. Ben Chin is the deputy director of Maine People's Alliance, where he has worked on grassroots social change since 2005. He helped build the team that won minimum wage increases, expanded Medicaid, and guaranteed workers paid sick days. Ben is one of the finest organizers in the country, and for sure he is the very best organizer, movement builder, and organization builder in the state of Maine, with so many wins that have improved the lives of low-income Mainers of all races under his belt to show for it. And last but not least, Amy Hanauer, who is the executive director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, as well as Citizens for Tax Justice. If you didn't know, she previously founded and developed Policy Matters Ohio from a one-person startup in 2000 to a 14-person operation with offices in Cleveland and Columbus. She is the country's leading thinker and advocate who combines organizing, smart policy research, and advocacy to advance social justice for working people. So if we were in a live audience, I'd say, please welcome our rockstar panel. They are quite amazing. I want to take just 3 minutes to provide a little context before I turn to the panel. As you know, we've been living through, all of us, multiple crises: a pandemic and public health crisis, a climate change crisis with wildfires and hurricanes upon us, an economic crisis of deep inequality before the pandemic, surely exacerbated by the pandemic. Of course, we're in the midst of a racial reckoning and a racial injustice crisis, a gender injustice crisis. I could go on. But the one thing I wanted to lift up to set the context for this panel, we just learned in a news cycle in the last 48 hours. And this is a study from the RAND Corporation that is, for the most part, not partisan in any way. And I'm going to quote from a great article that Rick Wartzman wrote from Fast Company about the $2.5 trillion theft that the 1% steals from working people every year. So stay with me for a minute just for these facts. A full-time worker whose taxable income is at the median, meaning that's half the population that makes more and half the population that makes less than the median, that full-time worker at the median pulls in about $50,000 a year. Now, if the fruits of our nation's economic output, as Rick Wartzman writes, had been shared over the past 45 years as broadly as they have been shared from the end of World War II to the 1970s, that same worker will be making somewhere between $92,000 and $102,000 a year. When you tally it all up, according to RAND, the bottom 90% of American workers will be bringing home an additional income of $2.5 trillion in total annual income. Let me say that again. When you add it all up, since the 1970s, the bottom 90% of American workers will be bringing home an additional $2.5 trillion annually if economic gains are distributed equitably. That is the $2.5 trillion debt. Theft, rather. It's a debt too to all of us, but it's the theft a year, $2.5 trillion in theft. The winners, of course, we know from the RAND data, it's the 1%. We know that. So you add to that Senator Brown's point about how the 60 corporations in the Fortune 500 that paid no tax last year. So we know the problem. We know the stakes of the problem. What are the sources? What are the sources of inequality, and what are the sources of racial and economic and gender inequality? And we could talk a lot about a lot of factors. Let's split them out between pre-distribution and redistribution, as scholars would call them. So what's pre-distribution? That's simply the background rules of the labor market and the economy. So a decline in unionization and worker power, a decline in the real value of the minimum wage, an increase in monopoly and monopsony power of corporations. That all determines how much money workers get. This conversation, we're going to focus on redistribution, because redistribution is about tax and transfer policies and taxation that helps to tackle inequality and provides for essential public goods that people need to thrive: public schools, clean air and water, childcare, climate justice, just to name a few examples. Tax policy directly contributes to economic security or insecurity. Tax policy directly contributes to racial and gender inequality or equity. There's an old political science question: who gets what, when, and how? And the politics of taxation and distribution is at the heart of this question, as well as at the heart of the question of power. So with that, I want to turn it to our illustrious panel. And Ben, I'm going to come to you first to ask you to talk to us about the tax fights that you've had in Maine, and specifically, how do you deploy data in the service of social justice for the data nerds that are listening and viewing us?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's so awesome to be with everybody. And yeah, definitely just want to start off by thanking ITEP for all their amazing work. Because the first story, two quick stories about tax fights in Maine. One is last recession, we didn't actually have this relationship with ITEP. And so when the state budget cuts came, everybody was saying, oh, we need to lower income taxes and broaden sales taxes, and that'll stabilize things. And maybe you'll even have a little bit less money, but like, we just have to make these hard cuts. And sorry if you need healthcare, sorry if you need public education, you just can't do it. And we knew intuitively that was wrong. Obviously, most state tax codes are regressive. Maine was no exception. And we could not actually say, oh, if you just tax wealthy people at this little bit more, you can pay for all this other stuff. And so every single aspiration that every community in the state had literally boiled down to one number that we just couldn't produce credibly by ourselves. And then with our soul brothers and sisters at Maine Center for Economic Policy, like Sarah Austin, who's on the line right now, we found our way to ITEP and found out they can produce spreadsheet after spreadsheet of different scenarios on how to tax which wealthy people and which corporations, and how to actually make all the numbers add up. And not only will they do that once, they will work with your coalition to get all sorts of annoying little feedback and really make it work. And so we have, I think, completely shifted that landscape heading into this really scary budget picture this year, a decade later. And it's 100% the only reason why we're able to do that the way we are is because we actually can produce this information, because otherwise it's just people, with aspirations and needs and not a real plan. But then just the second quick fight I'd talk about is on the other side of the spectrum, working on tax fairness has really helped us understand there are people getting money out of the state every single year, but there are big corporations and they're wealthy folks. And we started getting in these hearings around, say, the film tax credit, where there's just an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper where you write down, oh, how much money did you spend on your movie this year? Great. No receipts, no other paperwork, just sign your name and the state just cuts you a check for the percentage of that. And so as somebody who's worked on welfare rights programs and Medicaid, I mean, the amount of paperwork you have to do to get the most basic level of support from the state it's so different. And so I think that's been the other piece that has been really important, Maine, and great to work with ITEP, is understanding how all that money flowing in and out, that all adds up to tax fairness.
Ben, I want to ask you one more question as a quick follow-up before I turn to Amisha, and that is, fundamentally, how do you get people to care about taxes? And you started with the data question, and I also want to bring in what we heard from Senator Brown around the story. So how do you combine the storytelling and the data to get people to care and to be tax fairness voters, essentially?
Yeah, so I really appreciate what Senator Brown was saying on this. And I'd say there's two approaches that we've used. And so definitely foregrounding the stories of how people's lives depend on us raising revenue really matters to a lot of folks. And on the other side, I think there are voters, particularly working class voters of all races, who just really get economic inequality and racial inequality are tied together. And we actually need to tax wealthy people just as a social policy in itself to make our country more fair. And the thing that I think makes this conversation difficult is that, frankly, what we've seen is there's starting to be a disconnect between elites, even and especially in the Democratic Party, who aren't willing to go there on the tax side. And we see this when we canvass really wealthy, really blue towns, where oftentimes in towns that are more purple, even red, we have a lot of people who are excited about taxing the rich. And then we'll go into towns that are wealthier, and yes, maybe they're voting for Democrats up the ticket, but they don't want their taxes to go up. And so I think having leaders like Senator Brown and others who are true champions is the key to getting that public opinion to actually finally connect up to lawmakers.
Thanks, Ben. So Amisha, what in all the hell is going on in Illinois this year? And no pressure, but the whole country is counting on you and watching you. Talk to us about what you're up to. What is this fair tax thing, and why is it so critical for not just the state of Illinois, but for the country?
Absolutely. So, well, I want to first just shout out Amy, and for your, I'm really excited to see your leadership in action at ITEP. It's really exciting, and it's great to be here with this fabulous group of panelists. So Illinois, we are a state that has a flat state income tax. There's only a handful of us left who have flat state income taxes, but it makes us the 8th most regressive taxing state in the country. So we're completely backwards, right? So as we, I think, heard about earlier, it means lowest income people have nearly double the tax burden of the richest folks in our state. And we really know we have a lot of wealth in this state, and what's happening because of our tax code, it means that that wealth is staying in the hands of the wealthy and not going into the common good. Grassroots Collaborative did a study in 2016 that found that Illinois is the 13th wealthiest state in the country, but we're 47th in spending on education, healthcare, human services. Right, so this idea that we get told over and over that there isn't any resources and we just have to deal with cutbacks and we have to deal with, closing schools and all of the things that often, I think Democratic and Republican legislators tell us. We know it's not true that there's actually plenty of wealth, but we don't have a tax code that's actually making sure that that money is coming into the common good. I think the other piece to name, right, and I think ITEP is coming out with some research on this that really shows that our flat state income tax has really been a racialized wealth transfer, that Black and Latinx workers and residents have been paying, because we've been paying way more of our taxes, that means that the people have been subsidizing the taxes of white wealthy folks in the state. And it's time for that to end, right? And we're really excited. We've been working on this along with many other organizations for over a decade to try to change our constitutionally mandated state flat income tax to one that is graduated. And we have the chance in November finally for voters to vote on this. And we know that there's just a ton, there's a lot at stake here, not only for Illinois residents, but as you mentioned, there's national implications for us, because if in Illinois, a place like Illinois, where we actually know we have broad support for taxing the rich, and as folks have talked about, that happens, kind of all kinds of people. It's sort of common sense that you make more, you pay more. That's something that really resonates with folks across the board. But a blue state like Illinois, where we really have the ability, like if we can't win this ballot question in a place like this, there really are massive national devastating implications for the rest of this country. As we're looking at huge austerity, growing austerity because of the pandemic, state crisis, fiscal crises at every, across in all 50 states, that we really need to find the revenue solutions to make sure that we are actually, that those who can afford to pay more are doing that, right? So there's a lot on the line here for us to win, and we definitely are really excited about winning this in November and being able to then see how can this win be something that ripples across states across the country, because we're going to need it more than ever. If we pass it, I'll say when we pass this, we will raise an additional $3 billion a year from the wealthiest folks in the state. And so does that fix our crisis? No, but it's significant in terms of the resources that folks in our communities desperately need. And as organizers, our goal is to make sure that when we win those resources, that they actually go back to communities of color, in particular, working class communities that are at the center of this. And I think part of this big challenge here in this moment, as the senator talked about, was this question about the role of government, right? And I think that in particular, there are many voters of color, and in particular Black voters, who have been told and promised over and over of all the things that will change and will improve when these policies get moved, and over, the policies do not go back, the benefits do not go back to communities of color. They do not go back specifically to Black communities. And so there's a lot of work that we've got to do to make sure that not only that we win this, but then that we win this, that we make sure that race equity is at the center, and that folks who actually have been most marginalized, and again, whose wealth has been extracted for decades in the state, actually get the benefit of those additional resources.
Amisha, that was great. And I have one quick follow-up for you, because what I heard was especially why the stakes are so high because of the racialized wealth transfer in the direction that most residents of Illinois do not want, austerity politics, which is already upon us. And we're in the midst, right, of the largest social movement in American history right now, led by the Movement for Black Lives. So can you say a bit, can you paint a picture, once you win, what this will mean, that extra $3 billion a year will mean, particularly for low-income communities, but especially Black and Latinx low-income communities in Chicago and around the state? Paint the picture of like, what would that mean, say, by 2023 or 2024 for those communities with those extra resources?
Yeah, I think a big, as I said, the kind of question of the role of government in this moment is like really come into sharp focus for us, and sharper focus because of the popular movement around police violence, because we have been admittedly quite lazy historically about how we talk about the role of government, and saying just like, yes, and that's been in a response to the fact of forces that are trying to shrink government. But we haven't been nuanced about the fact of like, well, actually there are pieces of government that should not get more resources. And that is around, how we define safety in our communities and in this country. And so for us, I think this, what we're finding in our conversations with voters is that there actually isn't an ideological attachment to small government, at least not for voters in Illinois. That's not their orientation, and in particular Black and Latinx voters who we are focused on talking to. But it's a disbelief that government working for people is actually possible. And I think that's probably true across the board, right? And again, historic and current practices reinforce that idea. It's not a myth, it's reality. Folks are living it and breathing it every single day. And our challenge really is to help people see that actually organized people and people power has the ability to change that. And that we actually, that truth is not a given, right? And that we actually have the ability to force to organize to make sure that the resources go to where we need it to go. And I think what we're finding that folks, the race class messaging narrative work to show the connections between communities of color, and to talk about class in a very clear, explicit ways resonates. Again, I think folks on the left are too worried about, oh, well, we cater our language to mainstream voters, mainstream read white, middle-class voters. And it means that, in particular, when we talk about tax policy, that we take for granted Black and Latinx voters. And when they come and vote for things like this, they vote no, because it's about taxes and again, combined with the mistrust of government. Why would I support that? No one's talked to me about it. I don't get it. I don't believe it, right? So we really see the depth of conversations necessary, and really, and again, focusing on communities of color is really critical. And I think for us, we have to think about the role of how we reimagine safety in this period of time as well. And the demands that Movement for Black Lives and folks have been making around defunding police really challenges us to understand how do we actually, what is our role as folks who work on tax policy to back that demand as well, right? And to back the fact that, and that's not just about austerity, like, oh, well, there's no money, so take the money from policing. Yes, and the money going to policing is devastating and brutalizing and murdering communities of color and people across this country in our communities, making us more and more, making us more unsafe. And so I think that's been, a key piece for us to do, right? Is like, how do we actually understand demands about taxing the rich, ending corporate welfare, breaking up big banks, the power of hedge funds and finance, but also really understand the role of actually the need to demand for defunding policing and how white supremacy and class come together in clear ways. And I think there are many organizations who have failed to do this, right? That we really focus just on this class piece. And it's very much linked to why we are not winning. And I think it's very much linked and being able to connect these and live those values and have those tough conversations is critical for us to win, both winning fair tax in November in Illinois, but also winning fairness and justice across this country, moving forward to take on the racist austerity that we are currently experiencing and will experience in much bigger levels to come.
Thank you, Amisha. And you mentioned hedge funds and finance. So Maurice is the go-to person in the country whenever I have a question or many of us have questions around corporate power, finance, the political power of hedge funds. Talk to us about what tax policy has to do with these big fights around corporate power and all its dimensions, and especially around racial justice.
Sure. Yeah. And Amisha really just mic dropped it there, and so many good nuggets there. But I'll try and pick up on some of the threads. So firstly, I mean, congrats to 40 years for ITEP, and congrats and thanks to you, Amy, for your leadership and pulling this all together. There aren't really too many people that I would take a break from my vacation for, but you all are, in fact, I've screened some calls of some of the participants on, so I apologize, folks. But you all are it, especially admiring of, as always, Ben and Amisha, who are on the front lines of some of these fights. So, you know, Amisha mentioned wealth extraction, and, you know, we really think of that at ACRE as a core piece of the way that our economy just works on a day-to-day basis. And some of that is a result of financialization, so finance taking more of a solid hold in our economy. But really, it's more just built into the very fabric of how our country started and how our economy started. So folks create value at the bottom, and that value is, you know, and at ACRE, we particularly think of Black and Indigenous and Brown folks. And then that value is funneled up to a wealthy few at the top and corporations. This might seem like a really, you know, familiar story and sort of a, well, of course it works that way right now. But really, you can go back to as early as the seedlings of this country, and that's how our economy worked. It's built in to the very nature. So, you know, in present time, it would be one thing if that money that funneled up to corporations and the wealthy was then taken and invested really back into their workers and wages were growing, or invested in their communities and we saw infrastructure built out around where all of these corporations are, or you know, invested in different programs and infrastructure in various cities across the country. But none of that is happening, right? There's simply a beefing up of the thing that's invested in is the pockets of those wealthy few at the top. And with the current trend of taxes, it's even hard to call it a trend at this point, because I think it's really existed since before I was born, with really few exceptions. The current anti-tax trend, we see the ability for the country to enact a tax policy that can really meet that goal of redistribution in a racially just way of wealth into the things that communities care about. It's been virtually non-existent, right? We have, like, I can probably count on my hand the number of times, and I pay a lot of attention to tax fights around the country. I can probably count on one hand the number of times that I've really seen a very strong, successful statewide or nationwide pushback to, you know, this anti-tax messaging, you know, that's sort of a leftover from the Reagan era. And it's not just at the federal level, of course, where we, you know, at the federal level, we frankly have a lot more options than just taxes to provide for our folks who are on the ground, but really crucially at the state level, where Amisha and Ben and so many others are. So the really important thing that I like to focus on here is that the financial power that is gained is also political power. So those two things are linked really tightly in this country. So of course they're linked by political spending, and you know, we see corporations and particular wealthy folks giving lots of money to candidates and really influencing what those candidates and elected officials say and think and do. But we also, there's this other sort of, there's this other thing that's a little bit harder to nail down and exactly, where we see in respective states folks becoming kingmakers of politics. So everyone who's on this call, you can probably think of who that person or who that corporation or that set of corporations is in your state, that whatever they want is what happens. And it doesn't matter if it's directly linked to their business, the item that they're making or the service they provide. They're just the kingmakers. They're the folks who get the elected officials elected. They're the folks who get the particular laws passed. They can stop bills, they can start bills, et cetera. So, you know, here in Detroit, that figures Dan Gilbert, and Michigan does everything that we can to keep Dan Gilbert happy, in hopes that he'll return the favor and, through his goodwill, grant us jobs or charitable donations or development to downtown Detroit, or et cetera. So, maybe this is just me, but wouldn't it be great if there was this magical tool that could make sure that Dan Gilbert gave that money no matter what? If he's having a bad day or a good day, or, he hates Black people, he loves Black people, no matter what, he would have to do it. And that is the way that I like to think of the power of statewide taxes. We can just tax Dan Gilbert, we can tax those kingmakers and no longer rely on their goodwill or how they woke up that particular day, but instead really make them participate in society by paying their fair share for everything that they use and that they take from society. Now, would Dan be as powerful as he is now if he had to give that money and not hold it over our government's head? No, he wouldn't be, probably not. And actually, that would be a really, really great thing for democracy. He wouldn't actually get to just decide, one person wouldn't get to decide everything that's happening. We would actually have a truly democratic system if these folks weren't existent, if they weren't as powerful. So tax policy really, for me, has the ability to curb the power of some of the most powerful industries and individuals. These billionaires and corporations, they really aren't experts of what a good economy is. That is all of us. My friends at Groundwork Collaborative love to say that, we are the economy. If the economy isn't doing well for some of us, for even one group of us, then the economy is not doing well, no matter what. We need to snatch the power back to really define what a good economy is and to really control how we get the resources to make that good economy.
So Maurice, that's very helpful. And I have one quick follow-up for you based on what Ben and Amisha have already said about the state tax fights in Maine and Illinois. And that is for you, you mentioned you live in Detroit, which is one of the poorest cities in the country in terms of the tax base and the revenue base. And you've been monitoring the federal fights around COVID rescue this year. So can you talk to us about what are the little sneaky corporate giveaways in those bills that we should be aware of and that we have to fight against?
Yeah, I think we're I talk about this sort of anti-tax and really pro-corporate movement. And Ben mentioned it as well as you see sort of elite Democrats even as tools of this long movement. And I think one of the impacts of that is that a lot of these moves don't need to be sneaky anymore. They kind of like both telegraph and then broadcast that they won these things, like taking money out of a relief bill. And that just really speaks to sort of the power that they have in our economy and really our society as a whole. So, one of the things that I found most egregious in some of the bills that have passed so far is, there was a program that actually on its face could be really, really great to provide small businesses the ability to continue to pay salaries for folks instead of laying them off. Corporations were able to lobby to create lots of backdoors and trapdoors into that specific piece of the bill, which allowed, folks probably saw the myriad of huge corporations that were able to get loans through that program as well. Anyone from the Los Angeles Lakers to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, not really small businesses, either of them. The ability to blocking a merger moratorium. So, one of the things that really has created the type of economy that we have now is the monopoly power of corporations. We know that in times of recession, when some corporations are struggling, it's a real danger that folks would strengthen their monopoly grip on particular sectors. And the best thing to do to make sure that we're not giving that wholesale political power to them is to stop them from merging. And we see a huge fight and pushback and stall to that as well. I think it's important really to not nickel and dime the total amounts of the bills, of course, like there were trillions of dollars, but in fact, the amounts should be way higher. But we need to worry about how we're providing for actual individuals and for states instead of all of the ways in which we're bailing out industries. So like the knee-jerk reaction that many of our elected officials have on these issues is to, how do we make sure that these corporate power players are taken care of and they don't collapse. Instead of how do we set up an economy in a way that we're all doing well? And that's why lots of individuals got a $1,200 check if they got anything. And we're constantly talking about more ways to give corporations money. We're constantly talking about ways to make sure that, you know, corporate landlords are included in whatever rental assistance happens, or you know, they're always sort of the center of conversation. So, you know, when you look at tax policy as a way to really curb corporate power, that really would level the playing field in a way that would not be our knee-jerk reaction to every single piece of relief legislation that comes up, because we wouldn't have to fear just being in a corporation's or a wealthy individual's good graces anymore. We would get what we need from them by law, and that really is the power and really the entire point of taxes.
Thanks, Maurice. Last but not least, to our fearless leader, Amy, talk to us about how the problems with our current tax code were laid bare in 2020. Let's start there first, and then I have a follow-up question for you to paint the picture about the future. But just break it down for us. What are the problems with our tax code?
Yeah, well, and it was just so funny listening to Maurice, because of course in Ohio, that company is First Energy, which, you know, not only got the state to suspend its renewable energy standards and give them an enormous bailout, but it turns out was like completely bribing elected officials to do that. So I know that all of us who live in communities and work in communities know that company in each of our places. And it actually, you know, of course, First Energy, it really ties into the problems we're facing in 2020. So thank you for giving me like a perfect intro, Maurice. Look, in 2020, we're trying to survive a pandemic, a recession, an entire coast that's on fire, you know, police shootings, and this kind of K-shaped economy, meaning that the stock market is doing just fine and rising. Many professionals are getting to work from home and like ordering in, but other people are being forced into unsafe workplaces. They're often jobless. They are not getting unemployment insurance. You know, one of the things Maurice talked about, some of the challenges with the CARES Act. But one thing the CARES Act did do was provide $600 extra each week in unemployment compensation benefits, both to people who already qualify for unemployment compensation, which is hard to qualify for in the United States, and to some new categories of workers that normally don't qualify. So that was incredibly helpful. Of course, it's now run out, and you know, Senate went home without extending that. So anyway, the point is like it really lays bare the challenges in 2020. So we could hardly ask for like a better or worse year to demonstrate why we need competent, well-funded government, why we need a real democracy where low income, working class, and Black and brown people have some power and some say, and why we really just need an economy that delivers more equally shared prosperity. So it's part of why I'm so psyched to have this group of people here talking to us and have this audience who I know is here today, because I've looked at the list. Because I know you can help us get to that vision. Look, it's not something that's unattainable. It's not something that we haven't done a better job of in some ways at some times in our history. Other wealthy democracies raise a much higher share of their gross domestic product in taxes, and they raise it to spend on public needs. And they're willing to do more to regulate corporate behavior. And so as a result of that, right, these other wealthy countries, most of which aren't as wealthy as we are, have less poverty. They have more health insurance, much more health insurance. I mean, they all have universal health insurance. They have more paid sick days because they're willing to tell corporations that they have to do that, maybe because we're not, you know, because whatever, because of the ways that ties into tax policy that I think Maurice did such a good job of highlighting. And so this is a large part of the reason why the rest of the wealthy world was actually able to get this pandemic under control, even though the United States had more prep time. Look, we had 4%, we have 4% of the world's population, and we had 22% of the world's COVID deaths. And those were disproportionately working class, Black and brown Americans, people who had to go to work, who were deemed to be essential workers, as the senator said, but who aren't paid like essential workers, as I think Amisha and Ben pointed out. As for like the fires and the flooding, which has been happening today, which I've barely even had time to catch up on, We invest far less in mass transit in this country. We invest far less in renewable energy and conservation than other countries, and the other countries aren't even doing enough, right? And so this means that we use a lot more energy per capita and we emit far more carbon, and that's what leads to the hurricanes, the droughts, the fires that kind of leave us all gasping for breath. So like there is a lot that is needed to get us to a sane climate policy and a sane policy when it comes to a pandemic. But a better tax code would mean that we're raising enough, we're raising it from those most able to pay, and that we can use that to green our economy, to reduce our poverty, to provide healthcare. And that would have positioned us much better for all of these challenges that we face this year. So look, I think a different America is possible. And I think that a better tax code is one of the big parts of it.
So Amy, quick follow-up, and this will be my last question to you, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So just a reminder, put your questions in the chat. You just ended by saying a better future is possible. So I wanna come back to that to get you to paint us a picture. But before I go there, taxation is in the name of your organization.
Yes.
And frankly, let me just name the thing. When people think taxes, they think about, right, the old joke, the only two things that are certain in life are death and taxes. So it like freaks people out, is anxiety. It's like you think about the IRS, that's where people's brains go. So paint us a picture of that future. What would it, how do taxes and why the focus on taxation, why is it so critical to help launch us into a future of racial and economic and social and climate justice? Paint that picture for us.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think, look, we could be using the tax code to reduce inequity. We could be using the tax code to fund all of the things that Amisha talked about that her community needs, all of the things that Ben talked about that are needed in Maine. But it requires, like, as I think Maurice was saying, it requires that we stop relying on the largesse of, you know, a generous, wealthy donor, and that we start saying this is actually part of living in a society. And you, as a profitable corporation or as a wealthy individual, you're actually gaining the most from this system, right? You're able to hire people who are well trained, who've gone through our education system. You're able to get your products out to market on our roads or through our Wi-Fi. You know, you are able to rely on the things that the public sector provides. And that's why you have to contribute a little bit more to it. And, you know, as Maurice pointed out, like when we don't do it that way, we end up really beholden to these leaders, some of whom might be great and some of whom might be terrible, but either way, it's anti-democratic, right? We need a democracy. We need to we're supposed to enable the people to decide. So I think if we use the tax code in the right way, we would have the wealthiest, who are almost entirely white, so this would reduce economic and racial inequity at the same time. We would have them pay their fair share, and we would have corporations who are also owned almost entirely by very wealthy and white owners. We would have them pay their fair share, and it would give us the resources to invest in communities, whether they're white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, or Native American, you know, whether it's Appalachia, which has been deeply underinvested in, or Detroit, which has as well. So 5 things we could do federally, and I'm going to get wonky on you here, but there are 5 things we could do federally to get us there. First of all, we got to tax income from wealth, like capital gains and stocks, no less than we tax income from work. I mean, come on, it's like, it doesn't make any sense to say you got up every day and you worked 40, 50 hours a week and you got on an unsafe transit system or in a car to get to that workplace, but we're going to tax it at a higher rate than income from wealth. That doesn't make any sense. So we have to tax those at the same rate. We have to tax wealth itself with a stronger estate or inheritance tax. These are things we've weakened over time. And, you know, we need to explore a federal tax on the net worth of very wealthy households, as Senator Warren and Senator Sanders kind of put forth in the primary. Third, and this is certainly something Senator Brown would talk about, we need to tax our corporations' offshore profits at least as much as we tax their US profits. Again, like, it doesn't make any sense to incentivize moving jobs offshore and then reward companies that do it. We've got to end the business tax breaks that are promoted, like they're promoted as incentives for investment and job creation, and there's just really no evidence that they accomplish this. I can't remember I think it was Ben who was talking about the film tax credit. Like, you know, every state now has a film tax credit, and so it just means that the film industry like doesn't end up paying anything. Now, I think a lot of states are actually getting smart and pulling those back, partly because of activists like the people on this call. And fifth, I think we need to explore some really creative ideas being generated both at ITEP, but also by activists all over the country to make our tax code a better tool for reducing inequality, for greening our economy, for improving our lives. And this could include new and expanded refundable tax credits. And I know you at the Economic Security Project are doing a lot on that, Dorian. It could include a carbon tax so that we can, make our economy work better. If we do a carbon tax, obviously we have to do it in a way that doesn't hurt low-income people, but that's doable, right? And it could include a lot of other innovative solutions. Those are some of the federal things. I'm gonna also give you real quick 6 state level things that need fixing.
I love these lists. Go for it.
Yeah, I think Amisha and Ben have talked about a lot of them, but I'm going to give you 6 of them. Look, we need progressive personal income taxes in every state. As Amisha said, like a flat tax that's not progressive doesn't make any sense. We need higher brackets for the wealthiest. Even some of the states that have progressive income taxes, they have them where they top out at $100,000, as if a $500,000 or someone earning $1 million a year is in the same economic conditions as somebody earning $105,000 a year. That doesn't make any sense. So we need new brackets. A lot of those were created a very long time ago when $100,000 was, the sort of top that people are earning. We know that's not the case now. We need fair corporate income taxes at the state level that, again, avoid the kind of giveaways that Ben pointed out. We need targeted refundable state tax credits so that can piggyback on the federal, like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, exactly what an Economic Security Project is working on. Look, we need fixes to property taxes to make them more equitable and kind of to explore the ways to tax wealth at the state level since the feds don't seem to be coming through. I think there's lots of ways we can do that. A lot of states used to have better estate taxes better ways of taxing wealth at inheritance, at the point of inheritance, and we should do that. We've got to eliminate revenue raising through fines and fees. These disproportionately hurt poor, Black, and Hispanic community. They basically criminalize poverty, right? Like, so they make it so that if you end up, that you pay through fees what should be paying through wealth. And finally, really importantly, there are a bunch of anti-democratic features of our state tax codes. A lot of these were put in place in the Jim Crow era to reduce the power of working class and poor and Black people. We've got to get rid of these. Like, really, we can't have state tax codes that are racist. It doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense ever, and it certainly doesn't make sense in 2020. So people really need to be able to count on their government, and I think that was what was laid bare this year, to educate the next generation, to reduce inequality, to protect us from pandemics and wildfires, to address climate change. And I know that the people listening to this call kind of wake up every day to fight for that kind of government. So I know they're going to get us there.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And I think actually Stephanie put the link to your list in the chat, so you all can check out the full list there. So first question, that's to all of you from the audience. And the question is, can the panelists discuss the kind of particulars that are needed and useful to convince people that government can deliver real changes and what those changes could be? They say there's too much cynicism among low-income immigrant and communities of color about what government does and can do. So how do we turn that ship around about the role of government? And a few of you already touched on that.
I can kick us off. I mean, I think one way, I'm not a huge sort of narrative is the solution to all problems person, but I do think that we really struggle on that question in taxes in particular. So, when you talk to folks in communities, and when I was an organizer at the local level, I would do this more often. But you talk about things like their libraries, their parks, their street lights, the postal service, all of these things that that are extremely popular, that people love. People love their libraries. People love the fact that there are libraries, even if they don't go. People love their parks. They love the fact that there are parks in their city, even if they don't go. And really thinking about those things as taxes rather than, this bank account that you're paying into, and then some people far off decide how it's spent. Your taxes actually pay for and a lot of things that folks, and these aren't things that, again, like they're just a group of elite elected officials decided to do out of their goodwill. these are all things that we really fought for in different ways over the course of history. So, you know, there's lots of communities where there were no parks, there were no libraries, there were no schools, and we have taxes that pay for those things because we demanded them. So really that is a way that like both the economy and government works. We are not ourselves detached from either the economy or government. Part of our responsibility is making sure that we're advocating for the things that our communities need. And part of the way that our communities can get the things that we need is through all of our collective participation in the system of taxes.
So Amisha or Amy, and then Ben, there's a specific question for you. So I'll bundle that question if you want to respond to this one too. But Amy or Amisha, if you want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I think just building off of what Maurice said, like telling the story of the, you know, like breaking down the mythology of what government is to things that people can touch and feel and experience, I think is really important. And I do think all of us have local examples of where organizing has worked, right? Where organizing has led to change. And so, you know, for us in Illinois, one of the things that we have been able to do, like several other states, is get a $15 minimum wage. And that, I think, is like an example that we can point to of like here, like the power of organizing and the power of being able of actually coming together to fight and demand for what our people need. Slightly, you know, it's a little disconnect, you know, not tax policy, but I think the piece of, again, of like where government has worked for us because we have organized to demand to make it happen. I also think the other, you know, in terms of tax policy for us in Chicago, there's a lot of things that we can point to around tax increment financing in the city and ways that people have come together to actually we have won back, you know, tens of millions of dollars from, like, you know, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, United Airlines, Miller Coors, who all got TIF money to basically move their downtown headquarters to a different downtown headquarter, different size skyscraper, right? And so I think there's, you know, the challenge there is that people don't feel like that the best places where you can show where you can feel the impact, right? And so that we can point to those wins, like, do people really feel that difference in their neighborhoods? It's a constant challenge of organizing when you're going after sort of big things like structural change around tax policy. How do we break it down to things that resonate and that people can understand? And I think Maurice's example of, like, right, where can we point to where there was a library, a school, you know, we have definitely in Chicago a rich history of hunger striking to win, like, massive, you know, big changes around education and access to quality schools in Black and Latinx communities that we can point to. So I think it's important to say, even for us, when we have this big question on the ballot, yes, you have to go vote for this. And there's way more, all these other things that we need to keep doing and fighting for to be able to make sure that once we win it, that money goes to where it needs to go. That doesn't end the story. That doesn't end our work. We all know this, right? But I think it's really important when we talk to voters that we're not acting like everything's going to be solved by us winning on November 3rd. It's gonna be a lot harder if we don't, but that's like one step, right? And there's continued work to make sure that those resources actually go to where it needs to go. I think the last thing I'll say, I think touching on something Amy said, which is that, you know, we also, like, there is, you know, rate structure, you know, like, there's so much more money still to, you know, to be able to generate from places where it should be generated, and to get to real race equity, we need more money to be able to do that, right? If we're only getting kind of slivers of new funds in, that doesn't allow us the room to really start to get at undoing the effects of long-term systemic racism and white supremacy. So I think that's the other piece too, is like where we have to keep pushing to make sure that we are bold in our demands and bold and not feel like we have to cater to, like, you know, again, a center that we probably underestimate, right? I actually think the center is more with us to go bolder than we even understand.
I'm going to come back to that in a second. Amy, did you want to jump in quickly here?
Yeah, and I don't, you know, like, I would not presume, these are some of the best organizers in the country, and they are talking directly to people in a way that I don't necessarily do. So I think that both of those answers are phenomenal. I mean, the only thing that I would add is, like, these are directly related, and I know Amisha knows this because as I think Ben and I talked about on a prep call for this, like, when we have austerity where we say we can't actually pay childcare providers or home health care providers enough. What that means is that those workers, overwhelmingly Black and brown, don't get paid enough, okay? And so then they're in poverty, and that ends up having all kinds of negative effects for them and for the next generation. But it also means that for middle class or upper middle class people whose children or whose parents are depending on these individuals for care, they're depending on someone who's underpaid for care. And that means that your kid's childcare provider has to work nights as in some other sort of moonlight in some other job, or has to drive an unreliable car, or has to rely on unreliable transit. So these things are just all really interconnected. If we had a well-funded public sector, we could pay more for all these things. The other thing that I'll say is, most of us who I raised children, my children are now out of the nest, thankfully. And, but I depended on the public schools to deliver them a great education every day, but also just to take care of them every day. And I think 2020 is also showing us how much we all needed and depended on the public schools, because none of us can go to work anymore, those of us who still have young children. So I think making it real in the ways that both Maurice and Amisha pointed out is a huge part of the solution.
Great. Okay, Ben, a specific question for you. And then after this, we'll do a speed round of closing comments, because I'm going to throw at you 5 questions, and then you can take a bite of any of those that you'd like. But Ben, question for you. What did Maine People's Alliance learn from the ballot campaign around increasing taxes for those making $200,000 or more for education? The questioner asked, as I understand it, the legislature didn't want to raise its tax rate in competition with other neighboring states, but decided to give more from state coffers to education, so there was some leverage. What lessons did you learn, and would there be more success if the tax were aimed at a higher level?
Yeah, cool. So one point of clarification that matters a lot to us is that our surcharge was the law, and then Democrats and Republicans worked to repeal the law that the voters passed. So a major lesson there is we need to contest for power within the Democratic Party to make sure that does not happen again and not continue to happen. That speaks a little bit to the dynamics we were talking about earlier. One other tactical thing and one big picture thing. I think the tactical thing is we were surprised that the Hospital Association was our biggest opponent. They're taking huge amounts of money from Medicare and Medicaid, paying giant CEO salaries, giant surgeon salaries, and then funneling anti-tax efforts to the chamber. So our opposition surprised us. And I think the big picture thing that I took away from that campaign is we, I think, are hesitant to articulate a real vision for how public education should be funded. And the fact that it's funded through regressive property taxes, and we try to layer on a little bit trickling down from state income taxes and federal income taxes, is a real problem. And I think if we're going to go back and do this again, we want to really make this bargain clear to the public. And I think a lot bigger about saying, hey, what if the state actually paid 100% of the cost of your local public education, and all that money that you're paying in property taxes could actually go away? This is the social contract that we would actually like to set up for you, because we think public education shouldn't be based on your zip code, its quality. Your ability to pay should determine what you're paying in taxes, and that should make sure everybody has a good education.
Great. Okay, speed round. So I have 3 questions for you. You can answer all 3 or 1 or 1.5 in a minute or less before I hand the reins back over to our fearless leader, Amy. So question 1, what advice do you have for those working in tax policy for how to move beyond the comfort of incrementalist approaches to change? And Amisha, you started to go there, by the way, when you were talking about the boldness needed. So how do we move beyond incrementalist approaches? Question 2, as part of the work to center race justice in the work for broader tax and economic justice, what candid advice would the panelists share for how tax policy organizations like ITEP can be better allies in this critical work? And then last question, I'm going to paraphrase from our friend Alan Davis. Some people would say that every billionaire is a policy failure, and we now have centibillionaires, and we will likely see trillionaires in our lifetime. So how can tax policies address that level of inequality? So those are the 3 questions on the table. You each get a minute. I'm looking at Ben, Maurice, Amisha before I toss to you, Amy. Who wants to go first?
I could go. I'll just say very quickly, there's a great book called The Politics and Development of the Federal Income Tax by this guy, John Witt. And what he basically says, if you look at income taxes over the last century, everybody thought they were doing incremental thing, but the end result was not at all what people were intended to make compromise at the time. But their stated reasons weren't the same as the values that were reflecting the structure of what they were really building. I think we have to really get clear about the structure of these taxes and make it clear that we want our taxes to communicate that we're not going to get into deserving and undeserving poor. We want a fiscal system based on your ability to pay 100% all the way down the line for everything. And I think when we do that, that is going to be the way that we can actually start building bridges across lines of race. And as for billionaires, confiscatory top income tax rates, let's have a maximum wage the way we did from the 30s all the way through to 1979.
Great, thanks, Ben. Amisha, Maurice, who wants to go next? Closing statements.
All right, fine. We're both waiting. Yeah, that was like a ton of questions there. I'll speak on the incremental piece. I think that we time and time again limit ourselves in terms of what we think is possible now versus what we actually need, and organizing people, organizing the folks who live in the center, who are who are the people we're trying to, both sides are trying to win to their side. Winning people to our bold demands, I think, is a key part of what is necessary. Is the role of organizers, is clear, sort of the leadership of Black organizers in this moment across the country in terms of really clear, bold demands that if we are afraid of, if we kind of stick to what we think is possible now, we're never going to be able to get to the places that we need to get to. So there's always going to be folks who work on the increments, who work on trying to sort of, move slow, stop, make sure progress moves very, very slowly, and that we all stay comfortable. And I think we see that we are, like, comfort is a false luxury, and it is going to all kill us. Like, if that is what we're aiming for, we are literally all, we're not going to make it. And so I think that our challenge, and I think our role of organizers, is to keep pushing, and yes, move into that place of uncomfort, but also make the connections to what we know people have bold visions for their lives. It's just underneath a ton of discouragement and isolation, and that is growing and growing with this pandemic. It is our job to figure out how to break those things down, to figure out how we actually build community, because our only security is each other, and that is our job, right? And if we are really, truly all connected with each other, there's nothing that we can't actually demand and dream for and build for and organize for to win.
Thanks, Amisha. Maurice.
So I will say, on the advice to beat incrementalism, we really need to start throwing out some proposals that when they come out of our mouths might sound and feel wacky, but would actually turn our economy and the country upside down in a way that would be destabilizing for some, but really pushes forward the vision of what we think our world should look like. Ben mentioned the 30s and 40s when we had a better tax policy than we do now. Folks would have thought it ridiculous that corporations would pay zero in tax at that point in time. Just like folks might find it ridiculous that we could tax wealth of folks of over 50%, but those are the types of things that we should be throwing out. And really, the wackier the better. And over drinks or on Twitter, I can talk about my abolish statehood plan if anyone's interested in it. And the real proposal to stop, billionaires and trillionaires, and really, I should say, this is mainly to stop them from wielding the political power that we talked about, is through, both a wealth tax and making sure that the first thing that we do is make sure that our communities have what they need. So if you are starting a company and you're starting to get rich, you're going to be stopped if you're not paying your workers well, you don't have good healthcare, you don't have good workplace standards, et cetera. So wacky proposals and wealth tax.
Thank you to Ben Chan, Amisha Patel, and Maurice BP-Weeks for coming off a vacation for this panel. And it's back to you, our fearless leader, Amy Hanauer, to close us out.
Great, thank you all so much. So we're recording this. We will be sending everybody on this who registered a copy, because we know you have friends who need an email from you with a video about taxes. And please follow us on Twitter at ITEP Tweets and on Facebook at Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy to continue this conversation. And of course, at ITEP, we always need contributions to help fight for tax justice. Finally, I really have to voice my deepest thanks to our whole amazing team at ITEP, but especially to Stephanie Clegg, who made today's event so easy. And to this staggeringly talented leaders on this panel, Dorian Warren, Maurice BP-Weeks, Ben Chin, and Amisha Patel. So just quickly on the challenging questions that Dorian threw out, I think like I want the wisdom of Dorian, the books. I never talk to Ben without him recommending a book for me to read. Maurice, I think turning to history Maurice is always pointing to our history. And Amisha said it best when she said there's nothing you wouldn't dream for. So if I had like each of those gifts from each of you, I feel like we could get where we need to go really easily. And just on the incrementalism, like again, like going back to what Maurice said, I mean, if we just look in our own history, there's plenty of examples where we did this and did it more successfully in terms of raising taxes on the wealthiest. So it can be kind of incremental because it can be just something we used to do, right? And then just the one question, which I don't know that any of you answered, was Alan Davis's question about addressing extreme inequality. And I think Maurice did answer that, but like Ben did too. We really need to have a tax on wealth, right? Like we just can't continue to allow wealth to accumulate and pass down from generation to generation in the way that it has been, because we'll never get to the country we're supposed to be. So look, we need resources to tackle the big problems of 2020, a pandemic, a deeply unequal economy, and a climate that kind of staggers from fires to hurricanes to floods. And they have to come from borrowing in the short term because we're in a recession. But moving forward, we really have to demand that corporations and wealthy individuals contribute more to an economy that gives them so much. So like enough of the profligate spending on the rich and the austerity for the rest of us. Like that is not a formula that is fair or reasonable. So it's time for a new approach, one of really deeply investing in people and of really committing to the hard work of solving public problems, including paying for the solutions. I think we can rebuild this country in a way that really works for all of us, whether we were born in Detroit or Dallas or Delhi, and whether we drive a delivery truck or do vaccine research, whether we need help affording preschool or more financial aid for college, right? We can take on hard challenges. We've done it before as a nation, like we can do it again. And so this means putting meaningful resources into allowing our people and our communities and our economy to thrive. Taxes are how we do this. So thank you all so much for being part of this fight, and get out there and win for us. Thank you.